Hello everyone and welcome to my HTML tutorial aimed at absolute beginners who would be interested in getting into the industry or learning how to write code just for fun. And if the latter one is you, I'd say you're making a wise choice. I will be going slowly on explaining things clearly and in depth, so don't worry if you're not that technically inclined. Now, without further ado, let's get into the matter at hand. Now, HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language and is the standard markup language for documents meant to be displayed within a web browser. Basically, it's a format by which web pages, even those of highly complex applications, are rendered on the screen. HTML files have a file extension of .html or .htm and display the structure of the document. The two other important features, that are styling and functionality, are taken care of by other tools, which are CSS and JavaScript respectively. They're outside of the scope of this video, but I will explain them in further videos. But in order for us to style the page or even code some functionality, first we have to have a structure to work with. So let's get to it. So I'll start off, or I have started off, by opening my text editor of choice and a Google Chrome instance right beside it. Now, right off the bat, I'll just click here on the new file and create an index.html. File inside of this project open up in VS Code. And as you can see, the text editor automatically picked up the extension of the file as well as the language setting it will be displayed in. HTML. HTML is simply a markup language though, and not a full-fledged programming language since it's used to display data instead of manipulating it. It also has its own specific rules or syntax for writing code. HTML code consists of various different elements called tags in which the content of the page is placed. The tags are declared by enclosing the tag name inside of angle brackets, as we call them, but are basically less than and greater than symbols. These two. Now, anything written in HTML file will probably end up resolving to something, and I'll illustrate this by simply writing some text here and saving the file. Hello world. To view our file in the browser, we just have to drag it from the editor into the browser search bar here and press enter. And here it is. This will give us the local address of the file where it's stored on our computer, and it works. But what happens if I want to write some text spread out across multiple lines? For example, I can write some text here, like this, save and refresh the page, but it all ends up resolving as text in a singular line and nothing more. In the same line as our hello world text here. So content on its own is simply a stream of data that is to be represented on the page, absolutely nothing more or nothing less. That's why we need to segregate our content into different parts ourselves. Before I'll delete everything right now, refresh the page. And before we start, there's one thing that has to be done, and that's the declaration of the document type. All HTML documents must start with the document type or doc type declaration, and it's written like this. Doc type HTML. Save, reload, and nothing happens. Because this declaration isn't an HTML file by itself, but it simply tells the browser about what type of document to expect. The line that we have written here simply tells modern browsers that we will be using modern HTML code and that we will be conforming to those rules and best practices and standards. The HTML document now by itself starts, predictably enough, with an HTML tag like this. This is basically the wrapper of the entire page and represents the root point of entry for the document. It is also one of the 3 mandatory tags for any HTML document so that it will make sense on the web. Now, the first one is the head element, and it's generally used as a container for metadata. Everything including from additional resources to SEO optimizations and changing the title of the application. The title referring to this name in the tab right here. As you can see now, the title of the application here in the tab of the Google Chrome is just index.html, but we can simply change this by opening the angle bracket and introducing the title tag and writing anything here. Let's just say custom page name, save and refresh, and as we can see here, the title of the application has changed. Now, the second mandatory tag, or the third one rather, is the body tag of the HTML element page. And the body tag is used to contain all content that is supposed to be shown on the page, or content in other words. Think headings, paragraphs, images, hyperlinks, tables, lists, navigations, and so on. Now when we save and refresh, the document is basically all set for us to start adding content. Now, the simplest thing to add by far is textual content, and HTML provides us with a litany of different elements to handle text, depending on the context in which it's being used. For example, if we want to add the title of the page, as opposed to the title in the tab, we would probably need to use a built-in heading element denoted as h1. Save, refresh, and here it is. It's considered to be a large text denoted in h1s, and this is the largest one of the headings by far, but they come in 6 sizes from h1 to h6. Slightly smaller. Even smaller. Even smaller. The actually small. And teeny tiny. If we save and refresh this, we can basically see the difference between the sizes. Each one gets progressively smaller. Now, let's just delete all of this, keep the original heading. And if we want to add some regular text, for example, we would be using the paragraph element, which is just denoted as the letter P. Adding some text here, saving and refreshing, would give us regular, non-bolded, non-italicized, non-underlined. But if we want to, for example, link to a different page, we would be using the anchor element, also known as the A tag, written like this. Now, this is simply a link that points to a different URL, and clicking on it will automatically take us there. So, for example, if I write Google here, save and refresh. We get the link, but nothing happens on click. Well, that's because the anchor element, or the A tag link, requires what is called an attribute here, and the mandatory one is href. Now, href is the URL of the page we would like to redirect to. So I'll just write this, save and refresh, and once we click here, sure enough, it takes us to Google. Now, let's get rid of all of this. Save. Now, another attribute dependent element is the image tag, or img. If we just add it, save it and refresh, nothing happens. That's because, as I've already mentioned, it's attribute dependent and it requires two attributes in this case. For example, the alt attribute, or alternative, which is simply some text that'll be rendered if the image cannot be shown, and the source attribute, which basically links to the image we would like to show up. Now, I have some images here, and I'll drag this one here. It's flower. And I'll simply type the name of the file, like img-sm.jpg. Saving and refreshing would give us the image here. But if I misspelled something or am pointing to the file that doesn't exist, and I refresh the page, the alt text, this one from here, would be shown instead, because the HTML is trying to get to the image file called non-existent, which doesn't exist in this directory. But if I revert it back, refresh, we still have the image. Luckily, if we would like to render a list, it would be much more simple than rendering an image or an anchor. And there are two different types of lists to differentiate from. The bullet point lists, which are unordered, and the numbered lists, which are ordered. For the first one, we would be using the UL tag, which stands for unordered list. And inside of it, we would have the list item elements, which are denoted by LI, again, standing for list item. Item 2, item 3, save and refresh. And we get a bullet point list with these items here. Again, it can be anything, but this is just for explanation and demonstration purposes. And if we would like to render an ordered list instead, the only thing we need to do is change the UL to OL. Now if we save and refresh, we get a numbered list. Now, so far, we've only been working with static content and representative data, but more often than not, we might require direct input from the user themselves in order to make our content more dynamic. That's simply the core of web applications, and even some native ones in general. HTML has a built-in system for these purposes, as well as a couple of other elements that make the systematization and presentation of data much easier to work with. It's basically called a form element. And to start off, let's just remove this, save and refresh. And I'll create a simple form to emulate the registration to an app. First off, we will wrap our entire form in a form element. which is fairly straightforward. It's used to create a semantic HTML form for user input, which will later be sent to the server side for further processing. But since we're just doing HTML now, it'll act more as a wrapper for our form. We can further specify what is to be done by either using the action attribute here and pointing to a PHP file, or the submit event, which is not in the scope of this video. So it will be disregarded for now. Now, this simply creates the form, but on save and refresh, nothing happens. This is because, as I've already mentioned, the form element just acts as a wrapper in this case, and there are additional elements to require and request the input from the user and let them insert their own data. Now, there are two main elements which serve this purpose, and they are the following. The first one is the input element, and it's a self-closing tag, meaning it doesn't have its own corresponding closing tag like this one. And the code formatting just breaks here because of that. So if we save and refresh now, we get a fresh input where user can just type their own data. Okay. The other element in question is actually called the text area element. And this one isn't self-closing, it has a closing tag. And the difference between these two is that we can actually put some starting data in the text area and like this. And if we save it and refresh, it'll have some data to start off with, some text inside of it, which again we can delete and write something else here. But that's the main distinction between the input and the text area elements. So that's the basic distinction between the input element and the text area. Now I'll get rid of them. Save and refresh. But when it comes to the input elements, they're much more complex than first meets the eye. For example, this regular input element we've already had is just a textual input element, which means adding text and nothing more. I mean, we can also add numbers as well as special characters, but in the end it's just a string of text and it will be represented as such. The input element also has a type attribute here, which, if not specified, defaults to text. And if I just remove this here, well, in this dropdown there are a lot of different types to choose from. You can see button, checkbox, color, date, time, and so on. There are many of them, but these are the ones we're going to care about. First of all, the input of type checkbox. If we save and refresh, we just get this. Checkboxes are simple elements that can be toggled on and off by simply clicking on them. For the most part, they're used for some additional information meant to be sent server side. For example, having a checkbox and text here that says stay logged in is generally, well, one of the most widely spread uses of the checkbox element. But on the other hand, there are other different elements. For example, the radio button. Radio buttons are slightly different than checkboxes because first of all, there should be more of them. And each one of them is supposed to represent a value of like a multiple choice type we can choose. And they also require another attribute, the name attribute. That's basically the overall value they are going to refer to. Let's just put it here as gender, for example. Save and refresh. And if we click on one or the other or the third one, they will switch between each other based on this name attribute. But for example, if we remove this, save and refresh, we can actually toggle all of them. So that is one thing to keep in mind. The next input type I'm going to be talking about is the type of date, which simply on save and refresh renders a calendar the user can use to select the date. Fairly straightforward, easy as pie. The following one is the input of type password, which is used to securely put the password in so no one can see anything. On typing here, if I zoom up, everything is blacked out and cannot be copied and pasted. It just refuses to do that. Okay, remove that. And moving right along, the next input type is going to be email, like this. And it's generally a format for inputs used to somewhat resemble an email address. For example, if we had a submission button right here and we clicked it, it would basically tell us that the email requires an @ symbol and a dot something, which is really good for general low purpose validation of an email address. Now, so far so good. We can get the information from the end user, but the end user won't know what to type if we don't specifically tell them the information we're requesting. For that purpose, the label element, this one, is used to tell the user about the piece of data we're expecting, as well as to link together with the input element. Now, to link the label element with our desired input element, we simply have to add the ID attribute to the email tag. Let's call it just email. And on the label, we add the for attribute, which has the value corresponding to the ID of the input. If we save, actually, let's say that this is an email. We save and refresh. We get this. Some text here in the label describing what it's about. And if we click on the label, the input is automatically focused. If we remove the for from the label and the ID from the input, save and refresh, clicking the label does absolutely nothing, and that's why we want to make sure that our labels are always linked to our inputs for the ease of use. But it's not just for the input of type email or text. This would also work with checkboxes. So let's add our checkbox again. The stay logged in checkbox. Add the ID here. And the for attribute here. stay log. And we'll also have a label element here with the same for value. Stay logged in. We save and refresh. Actually, let's break this onto a separate line. Now, given the fact that these are linked, clicking on the label element checks and unchecks the box accordingly. Again, removing both of these, or just one, makes it so they're not linked anymore as well. So far, we've been talking about simple pieces of data and just requesting information from the user, thereby basically dictating the flow of the form. But for the most part, information gathering doesn't work like that, mainly because whenever people or developers, businesses make forms for their products, they always have customer feedback in mind. And that's actually the bulk of the information and data gathering. And it's done via a text area element. Oops. Which will basically emulate the questions part of the application, or the form rather. Saving and refreshing gives us a text area. One crucial difference that I forgot to mention about the input element right here in the email and the questions part here as a text area is that text areas are basically multi-line inputs, whereas general inputs are just considered to be single line. Pressing the return or enter key inside of an input would attempt to submit the form, like this. If I just type something in and press enter, the type of email does its job here and gives us a low-level validation to include the @ symbol when referring to an email address. But typing the return key inside of a text area just brings us into a different line. Okay. For the most part, submitting the form generally goes to the back end, or the server side as it's called. We send the data from the form, gets processed, and depending on what's supposed to be done and executed, it either returns us some new data, or we're rerouted to the other page, and so on. But in this case, we're just writing HTML code, and without any additions like CSS and JavaScript, or even server-side code. So just pressing the return key would attempt to submit the form. But the default behavior is just to refresh the page. Pressing return simply refreshes. But in our case, that's totally fine though. In the end, there's just one more thing that's required, and that's the button for the user to submit the form. Now, as already mentioned, you can submit the form, and I'll demonstrate it again by pressing the return, watching here. But for the most part, having the submission button is very much required, partly because end users come in all shapes and sizes, from young and tech savvy to the elderly who aren't as inclined, and who are by far the absolute majority, which has to be catered to. For that purposes, we will use the button element here, which isn't just related to the form element, but can be placed anywhere within the document body. However, when put inside of a form, it automatically becomes a form submission button if no other buttons are present. Like this. Clicking here simply submits the form, or refreshes the page in our case. Now, the button element also has a type attribute, and if we needed, for example, multiple buttons, let's just copy this one, called cancel. We would have to add the types to them as well. This one, apologies. This one will be the button of type submit, and this one will be the button with type of a button, which is basically a button that doesn't submit the form and has a different function when clicking on it. Clicking here does nothing. Clicking here submits the form. This covers the introduction to HTML. Thank you for watching.